Welcome to Et Al., a podcast from Baylor University Press, where we interview authors and publishing experts to bring you the best scholarship in the fields of scriptural, historical, and theological studies, as well as the world of academic publishing. Thanks for joining us. Welcome, everybody, to Et Al., a podcast of Baylor University Press. I'm Anna Kate, your host, and today I am joined by Lew Klatt and David Clark to discuss their new book, Playing with Fire. Welcome, you guys. So glad to have you on.
Thanks. Good to be here.
So this book is about poetry, which is kind of an interesting topic in today's world. But through the centuries, it has been used by Christians to express elements of faith, elements of life, of suffering, and of joy. And you guys take up this conversation in your book just so beautifully, the purpose of poetry within faith and the way that really it can dialogue with faith. And so I want to begin with a question about your introduction. Lew, you say, Christians today who write poetry, from Catholic to Protestant to Orthodox, most of them express their faith. Few of them are asking fundamental questions about the genre, close quote. So what are some of these fundamental questions, and how can one go about answering them?
Yeah. Well, thanks for having us on here, Anna Kate. I would say, first of all, poetry is a major art form with a minor audience. That's what my friend John Thompson says, and I think he's right. I think it's still a significant cultural force, and certainly we hope to keep it alive as long as we can in our generation. And I think it will go on because people naturally are drawn to language, and poetry is where language struts its stuff. As far as the kinds of questions, well, fundamental questions, I guess I would just say, what are we aiming for in a poem? What is poetry's purpose? As a Christian, as a person of faith, how does that affect the way I think about what I'm doing with a poem? I think too often we sort of segregate our cultural enterprises from our faith. And I believe, and I come from a tradition, the Reformed tradition, that believes that all of life is redeemed, and that part of Christ holding all things together in the universe is affirming the creation itself. And we as Christians step into that holding together. So we're culture makers. We're unlocking the potential of creation, and particularly the aspect of culture, which is language. And so how do we do that faithfully? How do we steward that?
Something I'll add, Lew, is that when we were inviting poets to participate in this project, we were looking for poets whose work we admired as poets. We weren't looking for Christians who wrote poetry. We were looking for the best poets who were also Christians. And that meant that the people who we invited were not necessarily thoughtful in advance about those relationships between their theology and their poetry. And part of what our project was in the beginning was asking them to think through those questions with us. Lew, I think, had a little bit different experience than I have. Since Lew works at a Christian college, he's regularly asked to talk and think about the relationship of his creative work with his faith. But for those like me who are coming from a secular school, that's just a question I'm never asked. And in fact, I think more often than not, other people don't really want me to. They're not only not interested, they might be opposed to that conversation, because it stands at odds with what most of my fellow poets are doing. So the chance to ask those essential questions was a new opportunity for me, and I think that was the case for most of the people who participated in this project. We were asked to think carefully about how our faith impacts what we do on the page. but we wanted to include people who were doing something excellent on the page to begin with.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. And I think you can really see that in the chapters that these people are true poets and true artists. And their artistry is what is shining through and getting them to think through those questions, those fundamental questions about the genre, but also how faith is expressed through that is really. I mean, it's an insane task, and you guys just do it so well. It was just lovely to get to read. And I think also to what you were saying before, Lew, I think of the scripture that says that God holds all things together by his word, and thinking about creation as an act of word and an act of language. And although we may not, think of creation as a literal speaking, but even a breathing, that kind of idea. But that there is this artistry in the word, and not only the word as Christ, but the word and human communication and language. And so I think you're right to point to that as holding it all together. So you guys have 4 sections in this book, and the first section is titled Tongues of Flames, and you kind of relate to this in the introduction to a Robert Frost quote, and then from that quote to Pentecost. So talk to me a little bit about this connection that you've drawn there.
Yes, I was talking about, you know, Frost says if it is a wild tune, then it is poetry. And so I was
Mm,
sort of talking about there's a sense in which even a very sort of regular metered poet like Frost conceived of poetry as something that is somewhat out of control,
yeah.
that it's a spontaneous utterance. And I was then just starting to wonder for myself, right? To what extent is poetry like the tongues of flame of Pentecost,
Yeah.
in which there was this expression of spontaneous utterance?
Yeah.
And I think they're very different. But nonetheless, these are the kinds of questions that Christians, I think, might ask.
Yeah, I think you're right. And so the first section of the book is titled that. It's called Tongues of Flames. But you're talking about poetry and revelation. So kind of this idea that something is being revealed or uncovered, similar to like you were describing with a divine utterance. So um, let's focus in on chapter 2. So the poet here is Lisa Russ Spar, and she just does a wonderful job. And she brings up soul cakes. And it's just this interesting conversation. It's just so intriguing. And I hope our listeners and our viewers will go and read the book because this was just such a great chapter. But I wonder if you would talk about how poetry does shape the soul.
Anna Kate, I love that you pointed us towards that one because I feel like it's kind of a good example of the approach that a lot of our writers took throughout the collection. Lisa Russ Spar writes about how as a child she fell in love with Peter, Paul, and Mary, and was especially interested in this souling song of theirs. And I think the lines are something like 1 for Peter, 2 for Paul, 3 for the God who loves us all, or something like that.
Yes, yeah.
And they're talking about the soul cakes that early carolers would receive at like Halloween and Christmas. These groups of children and the poor who would go singing and beg for little cakes. But what struck her was the idea that God needed some cakes, like that
Hmm.
He who made us all would be hungry for something. And so she uses that as like a metaphor to get into this question of what does the soul need to survive, and in what ways God might be hungry and have expectations for us. In what ways, is he looking for us to, I don't know, what is the word, nourish or participate
Mm.
in the nourishment of our world or something like that? So to go back to what I said before, I think that's a great example of the way that a lot of our writers kind of took, it's their task as a poet writing about the creation of poetry. A lot of these chapters are built around some sort of central metaphor. Josh Robbins thinking about Jacob wrestling with the angel, right? As it's the way that the poet enacts doubt in his search for faith. So that's been a useful tool for, I think, a lot of these authors to explore what's happening in their poetry, is to use a metaphor to start unpacking those essential questions. What does God expect of me in my poems? What
Yeah.
might he be hungry for? And how might I be able to nourish myself and those who are reading my work through my participation in this? Yes. consuming of the soul and sharing of the soul as food that supports others.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that analogous thinking is really helpful, right? Because poetry is about hunger, just as we have spiritual appetites, and poetry is about our hungers, our aspirations, our wants, our desires. And Lisa really sort of taps into that and begins to probe that further to talk about what our soul really desires, which is God. She reminds us of this Edward Taylor poem in which he describes the body of Christ as not just bread, but as heaven's sugar cake.
Yeah.
Um, I don't think we would try that to use that metaphor in church, maybe, but to have the priest or the pastor say, heaven's sugar cake for you, and heaven's sugar cake for you. Uh, but nonetheless, right, there is a sense that Taylor understands the sweetness and the goodness, right, and the delight of participating in Christ's body. So
Yeah.
I think Lisa was just very attuned to this notion of wanting and hunger.
Mm. Yeah, and it seems like so much of art and creativity is an overflow of that. That, like you said, it's not only to nourish our own souls, but to offer nourishment to others, or in this case, the idea that she brings up that God is desiring nourishment as well. And I think it also points to the incarnational um, aspect of God, right? That there are times in the Bible that Jesus is defined as being hungry, and then also, of course, all the imagery of hungering and thirsting for righteousness and for the kingdom of God. And so, but I think to what you're pointing, that nourishment of the soul, it comes about in art forms like poetry, and the idea that it's an overflow, just from our own soul, that it flows out onto the page and into the words of the poems. And I think that's just such a powerful image that she uses there.
I think incarnational is a great word that you're using there. I think
Yeah.
a number of our poets were reticent about even the idea, the notion of a Christian poet. And part of their reticence or resistance was this sense that, with Christianity, sometimes there's a kind of otherworldliness that doesn't really affirm the body. I think
Yeah.
that's a wrong sort of interpretation of Christianity, but it's a popular one. And, of course, poetry is all about affirming our created
Mm,
natures and the body, our hungers. Uh, po- Poems get real,
yeah.
um, and they're rooted in the earth. So
Hmm.
I think this is something that all of our poets seem to really gravitate toward. They wrestled with actually is how to bring these two things together.
Yeah, that's good. And I think about even in the scriptures where it talks about the Holy Spirit making utterances on our behalves for word that we can't express, or come up with. And I think about how so many times, to the Pentecost illustration, poetry is that. I think about the Psalms of Lament and just these poems of true grief and sorrow, and the way that they're able to express a grief and sorrow that we can't express otherwise. And I think it's true that it's so incarnational because it's mind, body, and soul that's participating in those emotions and then in the expression of them through those words. And so it's such a beautiful metaphor. So let's move on to chapter 5, where you actually talk about, David, the things that are not. And so you explore a series of paradoxes, quite a few actually. And so, how do these paradoxes in poetry help to uncover the nuances of the faith?
Yeah, I think at least in my essay, I was trying to start by thinking of what the believing poet might bring to the page that would make our experience unique. Do we have any? I've read countless poems by non-believers that have moved me and even deepened my experience of faith. But
Hmm.
is there anything that the believing poet might bring to the page that would be special? And I wonder if at least one of those things might be our experience of paradox. and our comfort in exploring paradox, and
Yeah.
the models that we have for a paradox. In the teachings of Jesus, that the first will be last and the last will be first. Those kinds of paradoxes look to step past ordinary language, or to get under ordinary language, to explore and introduce us to a truth that transcends our natural perception in some way. It uses some sort of inherent contradiction in language to unlock a truth that would otherwise be imperceptible to us. So I'm interested in studying a group of poems that are trying to enact those kinds of paradoxes over the course of the essay. And I'm interested in everything from the way that an image can be a paradox, or the way that a certain sound, or a sequences of sounds might sort of blow aside the veil that covers mystery and allow us to perceive it in a fresh way. And then the way that, something as simple as T.S. Eliot's "The way up is the way down," that to approach heaven, you have to humble yourself, right? Self-sacrifice is
Yeah.
a means of approaching God. But it's harder to engage that kind of truth when it's stated bluntly and abstractly. I often need a paradox to sort of twist my mind and unlock this, this insight that probably doesn't even last that long, right? I glimpse it for a second in a poem, and then I'm likely to lose it again.
Right. Yeah, I think that's beautiful, and something that I think a person of faith who writes poetry brings to the table, to what you're saying through these paradoxes, really is that nuance that I think faith brings to life and to an understanding of reality. That it's not, one way or another way, but that there are these paradoxes and these ways of seeing the world that are contrary to the way that they appear. And I think a lot about the Beatitudes and the idea that, blessed are the poor, for they will inherit the earth, and these paradoxes that really undo our worldview in a way that is poetic in and of itself, and that really just turns everything on its head. And so I just really enjoyed that chapter and the way that you use paradox, not only in the poem, but in the way that you view poetry as a genre as well. So part 2 is about brilliant absence. And in chapter 7, Kiki Petrosino begins by speaking of her lack of religious conviction. And so you kind of talked about, you introduced the concept to her, the project you're working on, you asked to participate. And it seems like from, her own admission, she was a little bit like, well, I'm not, maybe all that religious. And then quickly she nuances that view in the first page of her chapter. And so talk to us about that interaction with Kiki, and then how such a belief can manifest itself in poetry and the arts more broadly.
Yeah, it was a delight to have Kiki with us, and I appreciated her honesty so much. I think she's testimony of the residue of the Christian tradition in her life, and how she's trying to reckon with that residue now that she's lived in the world and experienced things that have challenged her faith, made her even wonder whether faith is really something that she can adhere to. We all have such challenges, whether those be circumstantial, suffering, that kind of thing. Also, perhaps certain beliefs that the church upholds that run counter to experience, and we all have to kind of find our way through that. She particularly was dealing with the suicide of her grandfather, and I think that alone, coming from a Catholic tradition where suicide is seen as a sin, a particular kind of sin. I think this was extraordinarily challenging for her. I think her essay is a beautiful processing of that. And I think in some ways, a connection back to the very faith that she is still sort of wrestling with.
I think one thing that she points out in the essay too is that the poetry is a place to do some of that wrestling, right?
Yeah.
And that because the poem doesn't offer easy answers, that it doesn't have to be a place where you are entirely a believer or entirely a skeptic or anything else.
Mm,
That often the poem is a place where these ideas do contest,
yeah.
and maybe that it's also, to some degree impossible for a poet who was raised in the church to exclude those influences from their imagination, right? That
Mm,
you use the word residue, Lou. I like that as a way of talking about this, but the history of Christian imagery in the background of Kiki's poems isn't something that, even as her experience of faith in the church changes, isn't something that she could eradicate even if she wanted to, right? That
yeah.
her poems are saturated with the life of someone raised in the church. Yeah.
Yeah, including the music and the cadences
Mm,
of and the rhythms, of the liturgy and of the scriptures,
yeah.
that have their own sort of, revelatory quality to them.
Yeah. For sure. And I think that shines through in her chapter. And I even think about Christian music as a genre, which so much of songwriting and lyricism is poetry. But I think about there's kind of a debate between people that label themselves Christian artists and people then that are artists who are also Christians. And I think that she was just such a beautiful example of how to hold those things in tension. That she doesn't, maybe, and you pointed to this at the very beginning when we started, that the way you chose these poets was not based on whether or not they were Christian poets, but they were strong poets who had this Christian background. And I think this is just such a wonderful demonstration of that, that although maybe, we sometimes have these categories, that some of that is best wrestled within a liminal space like that, where it isn't a hard and fast, I'm a Christian artist or a Christian poet who produces Christian music or Christian poetry, but that I'm a human and that you address issues of humanity and reality within this view that might, as you said, have a residue of Christian faith and Christian tradition. And so it was just an impactful chapter, I thought.
And when we invited these poets, we didn't know what they were gonna say.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
and that was the kind of excitement of it all, and that was, part of the generative quality of the whole,
Mm,
project, is that we really didn't know what was gonna come out of their mouths,
yeah,
and David and I, definitely, asked them questions, trying to, get them to clarify and to push them, even a little bit, but we saw a place for a person like, Kiki, as well as, I think we're all in different, places in our spiritual journeys. So I think
yeah,
this was an opportunity to come together, and it was a fellowship of sorts. That's one of the things that I took away from it. And when I'm in contact with these individuals, which is not that often, they always harken back to this time that we had together. At least 15 of the 20
hmm,
met together in a symposium, shared the essays, had conversations around food and drink, and just a rich going back and forth. And it was, for me, it was a little bit of a taste of heaven.
yeah,
And I think for some of them that it was as well.
yeah,
And it was a kind of fellowship that they didn't know they could have. Harkening back to David's original point of, he's sojourning at a school that's, somewhat secular,
hmm,
um, and maybe desiring to have these kinds of conversations. And I think a
yeah,
number of the poets were looking to that. In fact, I know that, when we first came up with this idea, I mean, this really was what was at the heart of it. I was being asked to explore how my faith impacted my art, and that was a part of my promotion process. And I thought these were questions that I'd love to hear from, and David, I locked into very early on, because I felt like he was a person that was asking these kinds of questions himself.
I'd go back to what Lou said about we didn't know what they were going to say,
mm,
but we knew that they wouldn't be saying the same thing. You know, we
yeah,
because of their poems and because who they are as poets, we thought we'd get some really interesting answers that would cover a wide gamut of perspectives of, those of us who are, are writing about faith or who are writing with faith in the background of our poems. So that was a part of the excitement for us, is that we wanted to hear some very different people get together and test these ideas out on one another, and that's it's a healthy debate and conversation.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think asking those questions yourselves, but then also asking them of others, is just the true work of faith and also of art, that you're all kind of considering these same questions about expression and about lived reality, and being able to kind of come together and answer these questions. It's really insightful, and I think provides something for those of us who maybe even aren't poets, but who also are asking similar kinds of questions. So, um, let's move on to part 3, which is about poetry and doubt, and it's titled Burning Questions. And Maurice Manning in chapter 15 speaks to living with God in the 21st century in the worn out USA. And is there a more timely essay than that? I think not. And so I wonder if you guys could speak to how poetry and faith work together to answer burning questions in a polarizing political climate like the one we're experiencing today.
Wow, that's a big question.
It is. Yeah, it's a lot to answer. So,
Well, first of all, just being able to articulate the questions, I think, is really important. And poets, I think, are pretty good at formulating questions. I mean, first of all, they don't say things off the top of their heads usually. That's why we're challenged in a podcast like this. Uh, typically, we ponder
yeah.
for a long time, and then the questions, emerge and then are reworked, etc. So, um, and Morris is a great example of somebody who asks tough questions. His collection, Bucolics, features basically a field worker who
Yeah.
is working the ground, the soil, and is in all that beauty, but also maybe facing some of the challenges of being, agrarian.
Hmm.
And he's asking a character by the name of Boss, um, what's it all about, and why do you do things the way you do? And sometimes he's shaking his fist at Boss. Um, so I think Morris has always been attuned to questions about suffering in the world.
Hmm.
And Morris is an interesting character. He overlapped with Wendell Berry in Kentucky, and he himself is a farmer. He also is somebody who has studied Thomas Merton quite extensively, and is someone who regularly visits Gethsemane, the abbey that I believe that's the abbey that where Merton was at. So I think what poets try to do is reckon with the world as it is.
Hmm.
As well as articulate the way it ought to be. So we're both prophets and dreamers.
Yeah.
And I think Morris is a great example of that.
Sure.
And a number of the poets throughout in the collection
Right.
are doing some of that raging, perhaps a little bit about the world as it is in its fallen state.
Hmm.
Well, to go back to something we talked about earlier, this is one reason why we weren't asking Christians who write poetry, but poets who also have, Christian faith as a part of their lives.
Yeah.
Too often, Christians who write poetry write as though we lived in a different time, right?
Yeah.
Or write as though the suffering and agony and heartache and hurt of the world weren't,
Hmm.
if anything, more dominant in our lives than heaven, right? They write in a kind of artificial heaven where, prayer fixes everything by the end of the poem, and we don't need to ask those hard questions anymore.
Yeah.
Morris is a real poet. He's going to ask those questions and play them out. And he's not going to be quick to give answers. The answers are often going to look something more like images than they are
Yeah.
political pronouncements. You asked about, in this politically polarized world, what poetry has to say to it. One of the things that poetry can say is pay really close attention, right?
Mm.
Don't jump into the easy answers that one side or the other side of the political spectrum might ask, but meditate on this image, see it from a new direction.
Yeah. And I think that's what Jesus does too when he's asked political questions. And to what you're saying, like I just think it's so admirable that both of you as poets and, the poets featured in your book are slow to answer, are pondering and are thinking deeply about these things. And so many times that Jesus was asked about the politics of the day, he responds with, as you alluded to, images. He uses parables, he uses pictures and word pictures. And so it's less about providing a hard and fast answer and more about pondering and thinking deeply about these questions. And I think poetry is just such a beautiful tool to do that. And I think that this essay just really brings that out. So really helpful.
Or he sidesteps the question and says, well, Caesar what is Caesar's, and fix your own life. Right.
That's
And
right.
the poem is especially good at turning us back to our own lives and
You're right.
asking us to wrestle with what's broken inside of us rather
Yeah,
than trying to fix the broken world.
that's right. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah, for
self-examine.
sure. Yeah. And going back to the nourishment piece we said at the beginning, it's again that nourishment of yourself and then kind of extending to others and nourishing others. And so, yeah, you definitely see that here. So wonderful. Well, finally, section 4 is about vocation and poetry, and chapter 16 in particular is a letter to a Christian poet by John Poach. And so I wonder what you would say in a letter to a Christian poet yourselves, and then also what you would not say.
There's so many things. I mean, I think I said about, I don't know how many thousand words that I said in my essay. So I guess I'd say a lot, but really, I think I would leave them with this notion of mystery that David brought up earlier. Mystery is at the heart of the universe. We don't understand it all. We have finite minds. I think poets are deep probers of the universe, and when you do that, and if you pay close attention, as David exhorted us to do, I think you do recognize your limitations. Eliot is famous for saying poets are occupied with frontiers of consciousness beyond which words fail, though meanings still exist. So it's the job of the poet, also the artist, right, to point, right, to the invisible, to the things that are unseen, as David puts it, the things that are not, and to recognize that there are principalities and powers probably at work behind all of the political fractiousness and strife, all the landscape desolation, environmental desolation that we see, and to recognize that there's a God somehow superintending all of it and moving it in a direction toward redemption, but it's not a redemption easily won. So poets have to be in there as witnesses to the brokenness and to the redemptiveness. And to do that without sentimentality, as Ben Myers says in his essay, very aptly, we're not about providing trite solutions to the world, but we are about seeing as clearly as possible.
I love the way that John answers that question. That his first answer is just be good at your job.
Yeah.
Right? That God asks you to be excellent and to do everything that you do for his glory, and that you need to be a master of your craft. If you're a Christian poet, you should be a really, really good poet. Right. So I think that might be where I would start if I were writing an essay like John's. Another place that I would go, though, is look for community. And
Yeah.
I think that was part of what motivated the creation of this book. It was one of the things that introduced me to John Poach. I studied with him as a doctoral student, and part of the reason I went to study with him was because he was writing poems about his faith, and I knew that was something I was interested in finding a mentor like that. For those who don't have a mentor like John Poach, this book is maybe a good step in that direction. I mean, we've tried to build something that is a
Yeah.
collection of letters to the young Christian poet.
Yes.
Yeah, and they can go as deep or as deep as you want in this book. I mean, there are some essays that are more full-blown poetics, and some that lean more toward lyric essays. All of them, I think, are very personal, and tell the story, the pilgrimage that these poets are on, the spiritual pilgrimage these poets are on.
Yeah. Well, if you are listening or tuning in on any of our various platforms, I hope that you will take this opportunity to read the entirety of their advice, their letter to Christian poets by purchasing their book, Playing with Fire with Baylor University Press. You can purchase it at baylorpress.com. And so we just hope that you will enjoy this book as much as we do. So thank you so much. And David and Lew, thank you guys so much for being on today. It's just been wonderful to get to chat with you guys and to get to read through this book.
This is a treat. Thank you, Anna
Thank
Kate.
you so much. Thank you for listening to Et Al, a podcast from Baylor University Press. We hope you've enjoyed today's episode. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to keep up with the latest from Et Al.